Hello, my name is Matt, and I am recording a video on my other favorite religion case, which I referred to in my previous video on the Lukumi Babaluaye case. I'm actually going to spend a bit of time in this video going over the kind of history and contours of religious legal protections in the US because it's kind of an interesting story. And then I'm going to conclude with the case and what I think the case may bode for in the future, since it's not actually a Supreme Court case, it's a trial court case. So if you think about legal restrictions on religious practices, you probably immediately think of the free exercise and establishment clauses of the Constitution and the First Amendment. It's the very first thing in the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It says Congress in there. That actually applies at all levels of government. For reasons I'm not going to get into, I think everybody kind of understands that. But it's actually more complicated than that. There's actually various legal provisions and protections depending on what you're dealing with, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So if you watched my Lukumi Babaluaye case video, you heard me talk about Employment Division versus Smith. That was the case where the court held that a Native American gentleman could not escape the legal penalties for use of illegal peyote by claiming that he had a religious right or religious obligation to use peyote. What I didn't talk about in that video is that a lot of people were really pissed off by the Employment Division versus Smith case. They thought that the court was too harsh, that Mr. Smith should have been able to use peyote, that it wasn't that big of a deal, and that the Smith decision bespoke a lack of protection for religious liberty in the US under the Constitution, and that was not good. So that anger led to something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which many people refer to as RFRA, which is an abomination, and I'm not going to use that. I'm just going to call it by its actual name. So as you can imagine, following the Smith decision, where the court extended insufficient deference to religious belief, some hard right, reactionary, religious extremist members of Congress got together and drafted this law to restore the rights and privileges of religious believers that have been taken away. And those members were, at the time, Representative Chuck Schumer from New York and Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts. Wait a minute. Those guys aren't right-wingers. They're liberal Democrats. Anyway, as you can imagine, this sort of full frontal assault on American secular values was met with great resistance in Congress. It actually only passed unanimously in the House. In the Senate, 3 senators actually voted against it. And then it was signed into law by notorious theocrat Bill Clinton in 1993. Now, what the Religious Freedom Restoration Act did, or does, or was intended to do, was basically undo the Smith decision. The Smith decision applied a very high standard to somebody who wanted to escape a law of general applicability because of religious reasons. What the Religious Freedom Restoration Act did was create a standard, or restore a standard that had existed before the Smith decision, that a law of neutral applicability cannot substantially burden somebody's religious practices, belief, exercise, whatever. Obviously, substantially burden is a very vague term by design, because it means, that just means that courts can grab a hold of it and kind of do whatever they want with it. But the upshot is that it was a lower standard for plaintiffs to seek relief than the Supreme Court extended in Smith. Where it gets complicated is here. Under the sort of spherical cow vision of separation of powers, the legislature writes a law and the court interprets a law, and if the legislature doesn't like the way the court is interpreting a law, the legislature can change the law and make the court, tell the court, no, actually, this is what we meant, this is what we mean from now on, this is what the law is. That does happen every now and then. The very first piece of legislation that President Obama actually signed into law was the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which undid a Supreme Court decision interpreting an employment civil rights statute in a way that a lot of people, including myself, thought was very bad. So that does happen every now and then. Obviously, it's not that simple because Congress is kind of a mess, but that's the basic idea. The problem, and that's what they were trying to do with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, was saying, look, this is not how you interpret the First Amendment. We as Congress think that religious rights are entitled to greater deference, and please do it this way from now on. The problem is that it wasn't just any law that Congress was telling the court what to do with. It was the Constitution, and only the court gets to interpret the Constitution. Congress cannot, by statute, instruct or mandate that the court or the courts interpret the Constitution in a particular way. Only the courts get to do that. And the Supreme Court so held in a case called City of Boone in 1997, and held that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was unconstitutional because Congress couldn't do what they were trying to do. But that's not the end of the story either, because the only piece of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that was actually unconstitutional was the extent to which it applied to states. I'm getting into federalism and a lot of stuff that I assume you know kind of the basics of. Feel free to email me or send me a comment or something if you want more explanation, but the basic idea is that Congress cannot tell the court how to interpret the Constitution as it applies to the states, but Congress does have control over its own federal laws and its own sort of arms of the federal government acting under color of federal authority, and Congress can say, well, when it comes to federal law and federal authority and federal arms of government, federal laws of neutral applicability cannot substantially burden a person's religious belief. Congress can do that because they're not interpreting the Constitution, they're just making rules for federal law. So at the end of the City of Boone case, the upshot was that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act remained constitutional, but only for the federal government, only for federal law. It's complicated, isn't it? Yes, I know. This is why people go to law school. But it doesn't end there either. First of all, in response to the City of Boone decision, a lot of state governments passed their own state-level Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, which tried to, basically simulate or recreate what Congress had tried and failed to do. But not every state did, obviously. So certain state governments care more about religion than others. So it is. So the point is that when you have somebody whose religious beliefs are being impacted by a law, you have to look closely at what law you're dealing with. Now, the case I'm going to talk about here, eventually, it has to do with the federal government. And where do you think a lot of federal law impacting religious practice comes from? Where do you think that scenario arises all the time? Well, if you guessed prison, you're exactly right. You can imagine that how this would happen all the time, and it does happen all the time. Prisons have very strict codes of conduct, down to dress and grooming, obviously, where you can be, when you can be, where you can be, what you can do, what you can eat, what you can say, and a lot of religions have their own rules on that, such as wanting to wear a beard, wanting to wear a head covering, wanting to eat a certain thing, wanting to not eat certain things. In Sikhism, Sikhs are supposed to carry around a dagger all the time. Obviously, that's a problem. I mean, they usually carry around these little ceremonial daggers that couldn't, be used to open a letter. But nonetheless, if prisons aren't going to want to have people carrying things that could possibly be used as weapons. So prisons, a lot of religious rights cases actually arise in prisons, in federal prisons. And it's not actually under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It gets even more complicated because after the City of Boone case, the Congress went back to the drawing board and passed the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Now, you might be appalled to learn that this is also often pronounced as an acronym, and I won't even let that word escape my mouth because it is a horrid abomination, even worse than RFRA, but nonetheless, there it is. Now, what the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act was and kind of an effort to take back a little bit of what the city of Bern case had taken away from Congress and trying to find ways to get back into state and local governments and protect religious freedom in a way that the Supreme Court said that Congress could not in the city of Bern case. Now, and it also very directly, as you can tell by the title, implicates religious land use and prisoners, institutionalized persons. Now, this act did pass both houses unanimously and was signed by President Clinton in the year 2000. And a few minutes ago when I was talking about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, I was being ironic and joking about kind of secularism and nowadays you would expect this kind of legislation to be pushed by kind of the hard right as opposed to liberal Democrats, and certainly not sail through both houses nearly unimpeded and be signed by a Democratic president. I think it's very interesting that 27 years ago, that was the case. There was enough widespread support for, relaxation of laws for religious reasons that these cases were, pretty much unanimous. These statutes were unanimously adopted. That's certainly not the case today. I feel like the amoeba has split on that, and it's a partisan issue now. And I fully acknowledge that the reason for that is that it was easy for people to get behind this back in the 90s when the kind of high-profile cases were Native Americans, religious minorities, people who didn't have a lot of power, kind of having their religion blocked by these kind of namby-pamby laws. And whereas in recent years, the high-profile cases tend to be conservative Christian businesses and organizations looking to be able to discriminate or deny contraception or deny insurance coverage or whatever. I get that. But at the same time, I would urge my fellow liberals to save some of the baby as you're throwing out the bathwater on these challenging, controversial, high-profile cases. Which doesn't really describe the case I'm going to talk about now, finally, at last. Now we come to it, I think. Yes. So now we come to the case of Stephen Kavanaugh versus Randy Bartelt. Not Bartlett, Bartelt. Mr. Kavanaugh was a prisoner in Nebraska. I assume that's where this case came from. And Mr. Kavanaugh was a member of the so-called Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And if you don't know what the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster is, if you are blessed enough to lack that knowledge, I'm regrettably about to make your world a lot stupider by telling you about it. So the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster started such as it is in the mid-2000s when the Kansas State School Board was making national headlines for insisting that Kansas schools teach the controversy about evolution and creationism. And what some edgelord did was he came up with this sort of performance piece where he was going to write to the Kansas School Board and say, well, if you're teaching all the possible, theories about the origins of the universe, well, I believe that the universe was created by a flying spaghetti monster. And you have to teach that as well. And, ha, 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 it was a nice illustration of how untenable the school board's position was. And if it had stopped there, I probably wouldn't care too much about it. But it didn't stop there. It has now become a worldwide organization of people united in their belief that believing in God is as stupid as believing in a flying spaghetti monster. Now, I can literally hear from the future, through the video, the howls of protest from people who should know better about the way I just described this organization. I can hear you saying, no, it's stupid, it was secular values and privileges. No, Stop it. Shut up. You're wrong. That's flim-flam. All right? The Flying Spaghetti Monster folks believe that, or they espouse the belief that believing in God is as stupid as believing in a flying spaghetti monster. And if you are going to espouse or defend that sort of intellectual bankruptcy, just own it and don't pretend you are making any more sophisticated philosophical or moral point. You are not. It is bamboozlery. Stop it. So what do the flying spaghetti monster folks do besides insult the overwhelming majority of people on Earth because they believe in God? Well, they have a big hard-on for religious exemptions to laws of general applicability, like were at issue in the cases we've been talking about and the statutes we've been talking about. One way they often get themselves into the news is that they object to the very harmless practice of states allowing Muslims to wear head coverings in driver's license photos, and they insist that they be allowed to wear colanders in their driver's license photos. That's one thing that they do, and they're in the news for that all the time, because as we all know, in this day and age, ginning up hostility and being hostile toward Muslims is really cool and funny. So as for Mr. Kavanaugh, he was demanding certain privileges in the prison as a result of his affiliation with the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, or status as a Pastafarian, which is what they call themselves. In particular, he wanted to eat the sacramental food of his so-called organization, which is spaghetti and meatballs, and he wanted to dress like a pirate. Very serious stuff. And the prison would not let him because they realized that his demands were complete bullcrap, so he sued the prison under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, and he argued that his religious beliefs as a member of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster were being infringed in violation of that statute by the prison refusing to let him eat spaghetti and dress like a pirate. So what did the court do? Did the court decide this is a substantial burden on his religious beliefs and that they had to let him do this? Well, no. In fact, the court didn't even get there. The court held, giving him the middle finger, that Pastafarianism is not a religion at all and does not even implicate the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Now, the specific reasoning behind this conclusion has to do with the particular test that courts, at least in this district or in this circuit, apply when deciding whether a self-proclaimed religious affiliation actually triggers protections under these federal laws. I'm not going to get into the details of that. You can find the decision online. It's a very detailed and very thoughtful analysis, I think. I think the upshot of it is that it's very, very obvious to anybody with a room temperature IQ or higher that the Flying Spaghetti Monster folks are not a religious organization. They are, in fact, an anti-religious organization. They exist only to denigrate and parody religion, and therefore allowing them to use that to demand protections under federal religious civil rights laws would be anathema to the entire legal purpose of those laws. And I completely agree with that. Now, you might be wondering, well, how come they got to wear colanders on their heads and this and that? Well, it's because, those are state governments, first of all, but also in a lot of these cases, it's easier to just roll your eyes and let them do it than try to have a big federal case about it, like this guy did here. Obviously, in a prison, somebody demanding special food and special attire is much harder to accommodate. So the warden here fought it all the way to the district court. Now, this is only a trial court decision. It's a U.S. district court decision. It did not go to the Court of Appeals, let alone the Supreme Court. So this is not the law of the land. It's what we call persuasive precedent. If this issue ever came up again in another court, they could rely on this, or they could not. They could do something different. I'm not actually really sure this is ever going to come up again in this particular context, but what I do think will happen if people are stupid enough to try this is that the Satanists will get themselves declared to be not a religion, and that would be awesome. And when I say Satanist, I mean people like the Church of Satan and the Satanic Temple. I can't keep them straight. They're both a bunch of idiots who don't believe in Satan, don't believe in God, and get really mad if you assume that they worship Satan just because they call themselves Satanists. And much like the spaghetti monster people that exist only to mock and belittle religion and sort of troll people. What the Satanists are more inclined to do is they show up around the holidays and go to government buildings where there are holiday displays that invoke either Christian or Jewish or other religious traditions, and then they insist that they be allowed to put up a satanic holiday decoration, and then again, governments typically roll their eyes and let them do it, or they shut down. They take away the harmless religious decorations, making people sad. So I think that the Satanists are probably stupid enough to take one of their cases all the way to the Supreme Court if they ever actually do get shut down. They have a pretty good streak of getting what they want. Again, with a lot of eye rolling and just not wanting to fight it. They were one of the groups was recently granted, tax exempt status as a religious organization by the IRS. That was big news for people like me. Again, I think it was just, the IRS not wanting to get into a big fight about it and saying, fine, whatever, you guys can have your fake religion. And when I say dumb enough, it's because there are these other kind of sticky beak secular organizations like the American Humanist Association and the Freedom from Religion Foundation have actually had some losses recently and have decided not to press their cases forward with the Supreme Court, kind of reading the writing on the wall that they're not going to get a friendly audience for any of their bullcrap if they get that far. But I think the Satanists are stupid enough to try, and then we might get a nationwide ruling from the Supreme Court that Satanism is not a religion, and that would kick ass. So anyway, this has been a very long video, and if you've made it this far, thank you. That is my other favorite religion case, because I think that idea of having a legal threshold to show that your so-called religion even passes the sniff test for being a religion is important if you're going to be dealing with complex legal protections for actual, valid, sincere religious belief. Thanks, and have a good day.